Hello everyone. Today we'll be looking at the morphological features of permanent mandibular incisors, and we'll be emphasizing on the identifying and distinguishing characteristics of permanent mandibular incisors. So the learning objectives of this video are that we will be identifying the maxillary and mandibular incisors on pictures, and based on what we have been discussing, you can identify the same features on models. Secondly, we'll be looking at the anatomical landmarks, and the most importantly, we'll be looking at the identifying and distinguishing characteristics of these teeth, by which we can compare and contrast not only mandibular incisors with maxillary incisors, but also with other teeth. So here is the mandibular incisors, and what we actually see here is this is actually a maxillary central incisor, and what we see here are actually mamelons, and these mamelons are actually labial lobes, or they're also known as developmental lobes. Now, what actually happens is that when these teeth erupt into the oral cavity, these mamelons are worn off by the normal wear and tear of mastication, of chewing of food, and this is known as incisal wear. Now, incisal wear is specifically on the labial of mandibular incisors and on the lingual sides of the maxillary incisors. So, and this is considered to be normal and physiological, as the teeth, they need to occlude in order to masticate. Now, this is an example of mandibular incisors in which there are mamelons and they are being worn off. So, clinically, if any patient who is in his second decade of life, or even later on, and if you see mamelons, it means the patient has open bite, and it's not, and that patient is not, that individual is not actually occluding on those teeth. So this is an example of a partially worn mamelon on mandibular incisor, and this all of the mamelons, they get worn off with age, and this is considered to be normal. Now, if you just look at the relative sizes of mandibular incisors, so the largest of all of the incisors is the maxillary central incisors, shown here by the numbers 8 and 9. And then it is followed by the maxillary lateral incisors, and the maxillary lateral incisors are shown here by the universal numbering system as 7 and 10. So, and the four mandibular incisors, if you compare them, contrast them in terms of their size, then the mandibular lateral incisors are larger in size as compared to the mandibular incisors, and the mandibular central incisors are actually the smallest of all of the incisors. And not only are they smallest in all dimensions and not just the crown and root. So here is the lingual anatomy of a mandibular incisor, and we are comparing here with the maxillary incisor. So on the left we have, so this is a maxillary incisor, and here we have a mandibular incisor. So if you just compare it in terms of anatomy in all dimensions, the mandibular incisor is actually smaller in size as compared to the maxillary incisor. The cingulum is more prominent, more conspicuous in the maxillary central incisor, while in the mandibular incisor, the cingulum is quite small and it is not as bulbous as it is in the maxillary central incisor. Next, we'll be looking at the root and crown proportions of the mandibular incisors from the labial aspect. So the mandibular incisor root, it actually appears that it is relatively longer as compared to the crown, but the overall dimensions of the maxillary central incisor are larger than the mandibular central incisor, but because the mandibular central incisor is so small and its roots are so small, but they appear to be longer and slender as compared to the maxillary central incisor. So this is the maxillary central incisor, and this is the mandibular central incisor. So now we'll be looking at the arch triads. By arch triads mean whenever we are comparing a tooth with a tooth which is present in the mandibular arch with a tooth that is present in its counterpart in the maxillary arch is known as the arch triads. So in terms of arch triads, the mandibular incisors as compared to the maxillary, they have smaller crowns. We have already talked about that it is smaller in all dimensions as compared to the maxillary central incisor. Secondly, it has flatter proximal outlines, and its cervical ridges and its cingulum is not as prominent as the maxillary central incisor. The the contact areas are the contact points of the mandibular central incisor are actually very close to the incisal edge, and they are usually in the incisal 1/3 of the incisal edge. The roots, they appear to be relatively longer as compared to the crowns, but the maxillary central incisor has a root which is longer than the mandibular central incisor. Now, if we compare the arch triads from the labial aspect, we also see that they have relatively wider crowns faciolingually. Now, what does that mean? So, if we compare the maxillary central incisor and the mandibular central incisor in terms of mesiodistal dimensions, mesiodistal and faciolingual dimensions. So, faciolingually, the mandibular central incisor is faciolingually wider than its mesiodistal dimensions, while the maxillary central incisor, its mesiodistal dimensions are actually larger. They have smoother lingual surface, as we have already discussed, and not only are the lingual surfaces smoother, and their proximal surface is also smoother, and their cingulum is quite small. So next we'll be looking at the arch triads that will be continuing. So the mandibular incisors versus the maxillary has incisal edges that are more lingual to the midroot axis. So what does that mean? So if we draw a line perpendicular from the apical 1/3 and we take it around the cervical and up to the incisal edge. So the incisal edge will be actually a little bit more lingual to the midroot. While if we draw a line which is centered on the apical 1/3 and we continue to move it towards the crown, so the incisal edge of the maxillary central incisor is a little bit labial to this bisector. Now the crown shape of the mandibular incisors. The mandibular lateral, as we have already discussed, is actually larger than the central. So the mandibular central incisor is the smallest tooth in the oral cavity, and it is the most symmetrical tooth in the oral cavity. And another feature is that its contact areas are both found in the incisal 1/3. So another important identifying and distinguishing characteristic of mandibular lateral incisor is that it has a disto-incisal line angle that is much more rounded. So here, so disto-incisal line angle is much more rounded than its mesio-incisal line angle, which is much more squarish or much more straighter or much more angular as compared to the mandibular central incisor. So the incisal proximal edges of mandibular incisors. So the mandibular central incisor has its mesio-incisal and disto-incisal line angle both at the same height, while the lateral has its disto-incisal line angle which is more rounded than the mesio-incisal line angle. So if you consider the proximal contact areas of mandibular incisors, the mandibular central has the mesial and distal contacts at the same level, and it is usually found at the incisal 1/3. So the contact areas of central incisor are both at the same level, and it is at the incisal 1/3. While the mandibular lateral has a mesial contact which is much more incisal as compared to the distal. So if you just look, this is the mesial surface and this is the distal surface. At the contact area on the lateral incisor, on the mesial aspect, is much more incisal as compared to the contact area which is on the distal side. It is much more towards the cervical line. So it is in the middle 1/3. Another important identifying feature is that there is a mesial longitudinal root depression, which can be seen here. So this is a mesial longitudinal root depression which is found on the mandibular central incisor. It has root depressions on both the mesial aspect of the root and the distal aspect, but on the mesial aspect is much more pronounced. Okay, now this is one of the most important features in terms of identifying and distinguishing characteristics of a mandibular lateral incisor, and this is the distolingual twist. Now, this is the mesial aspect of the mandibular lateral incisor, and from the mesial aspect, you can actually see a little bit of the lingual aspect as well. And this is why, and this is possible. Why? Because the crown is little bit tilted around its cervical line, and this tilt can be seen from the incisal as well. So this is the distolingual twist. Instead of it being in a straight line, it is little bit curved on the distal side and on the lingual side. And this is the identifying and distinguishing characteristic of mandibular lateral incisor, and which is the presence of a distolingual twist. Now, the crown outline of mandibular central incisors are symmetrical, while laterals are not symmetrical. We have already talked about that. Mandibular lateral has a cingulum which is distal to the midroot axis. So, if you draw a line which crosses the root, so it is a little bit distal to the midroot axis, while it remains in the center in the mandibular central incisor. Now, we'll just summarize the main points of a mandibular central incisor in terms of its identifying and distinguishing characteristics. First of all, the incisal ridge is slightly lingual of the faciolingual bisector. The lingual fossa is trapezoidal in shape. When compared to the maxillary central incisor, the crown is much more angular. It has much more squarish incisal line angles. Mandibular central incisor is considered to be the narrowest in terms of mesiodistal dimensions of all the teeth. It is also the smallest tooth in the oral cavity. The crown is considered to be bilaterally symmetrical, and the contact areas which are present on the proximal areas are present on the incisal 1/3 of the crown. The root is wider in a faciolingual dimension than and it's much narrower mesiodistally. The root has developmental depressions on both the mesial and distal surfaces, and it also has tendency for two canals. So if two canals are present, then they're on the facial. One is known as on the facial canal, and then there's the other one which is on the lingual aspect and is known as the lingual canal. And only in very rare occasions does it have two roots. While if you compare the mandibular incisors with the lateral incisor, the central is actually smaller than the lateral. The central is much more angular, and it has contact areas both and in the incisal 1/3. Both roots have mesial and distal root surface depressions, and the roots are rarely bifurcated. So incisal edge is straight on the central, while the incisal edge on the lateral exhibits a lingual twist to the distal portion, which is known as the distolingual twist. So the crest of the cingulum of both incisors are slightly offset to the distal. Both incisors have a lingual surface in anatomy which is inconspicuous, especially as compared to their maxillary counterparts, as compared to the maxillary central incisor and lateral incisor. The contact areas of both incisors are located in the incisal 1/3, but the central is said to exhibit less incisal embrasure space than the lateral. So the incisal embrasure space on the lateral is considered to be the smallest embrasure space which is found anywhere in the oral cavity. And lastly, both incisors from a proximal view are displayed on the side. They are lingually positioned in comparison to the crest of curvature of the cemento-enamel junction and the respective root apices. So if we draw a line from the apex and we take it to the crown, so the incisal edge will be a little bit lingual to the aspect. So that's all for now. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please write in the comment section.